All right, so as I mentioned last time and is outlined in our syllabus, we are coming to the end of our first topic, right? So looking at the structure of the class or the course, our first topic, Folly and Madness, right, is our first topic. So we've had these stories looking at people who are either exploring the realm of insanity, craziness, madness, those kinds of things, irrationality, and then, of course, complementing that, people who are not crazy but who are doing things that are foolish or irrational or difficult to explain in a logical sort of way, right? So, so we're coming towards the end of that first section, right? This is important because when we come to our midterm exam, of course, right, when we look at those, have those two essay questions, one of the essay questions will be asking you to talk about this set of stories, right? So out of these, you'll need to talk about 3 of these stories at least, right? And then the second question will talk about 3 of the stories from here, okay? So with today and Thursday, that will conclude this section on Folly and Madness. Okay. So today's story by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And as usual, since we haven't looked at this author yet, of course we will read some more of his stories in the next section of the class, right? Particularly because our next section, our next topic is that of superstition and religion, and Hawthorne, of course, strongly influenced by a lot of religious ideas. So in looking at this context, who can tell me some things about Hawthorne? Who is he? Where is he from? When was this published? Those kinds of questions that we ask about the context of something. Where is he from? He is an American, yes, right? And of course, he is one of the most famous of the American Romantics, and not just of the American Romantics, but really of all American literature, right? His most famous work would be The Scarlet Letter, right? Published in 1850. So if we think back to our Romantic time periods, remember we sort of did a quick survey of where Romanticism sort of peaked and where it was most popular at different places and different times, and we said that in America, the peak of Romanticism tended to happen between about 1840 and 1855, right? Most of the big famous works that come from that time period in American Romanticism, right? So Scarlet Letter was 1850, okay? So what else can you tell me about Nathaniel Hawthorne? Anything else? He's an American.
He's famous for his Puritan volumes.
Right, yes, and this is one of the things that connects him to his interest in the history of America, right? Is that, you know, certainly the British part of the United States, that New England area in particular, was founded by Puritan settlers, right? And we'll talk, in fact, more about that particular context when we look at his 2 other stories, Young Goodman Brown and The Minister's Black Veil, because those both specifically are set and draw from those Puritan ideas. All right? So that's a more specifically religious one, right? And also those of you who have read the Scarlet Letter would know as well that, that Hawthorne sets his stories also back in the time of the Puritans in that particular novel as well, right? So I've mentioned to you before that like this is one of the things that the Romantics actually start to do that is an innovation, something new in both short stories and in the novel, is this what we call historical fiction, right? Is writing stories, you know, I'm writing it now, but I'm setting it back, you know, back in the Middle Ages, back in the Renaissance, back several hundred years, back in the time of the Puritans, right? And this is one of the innovations that the Romantics come up with. Very often, they project their own values back onto, excuse me, back onto those earlier time periods. But in Hawthorne's case, he was, particularly because he was descended from some quite famous Puritans, that he wants to sort of reevaluate some of the ideas and some of the culture that he sees in America that's still being influenced by those origins. Okay. Hawthorne also, our first author that we looked at in this class was Edgar Allan Poe, and Hawthorne was a friend of Poe's, right? And so they read each other's work, and together, right, you notice that both Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne, while our stories are mostly quite dark, quite sort of downbeat in their style, they in particular are known as a sort of a branch of Romanticism. Those two authors known as dark Romanticism. Dark Romanticism. So you can see that they take a sort of more bleak and difficult and sometimes pessimistic view of human beings and human nature and the way in which we behave, right? And certainly it's reflected in this particular story. That said, is our story set in America? We're not told where it's set, is it?
Well, in the end, it is mentioned that someone found the youth in Florida.
Right.
On the peninsula of Florida. So one might think that the whole story is set in the United States, but it's not explicitly set.
Yeah, it's possible. Well, it's possible it's set in another part of the United States, like away from Florida, but you're right. It's not clear to us because the doctor of the title, Dr. Heidegger, is what kind of name? What kind of family name is that? Heidegger, Gustav. Right. Yes, his famous German name, because there's a very famous 20th century philosopher, Martin Heidegger. So this name Heidegger is a German name, but the names of the people that he brings in, right? They're all sort of they all sound kind of English to me anyway. The names that he uses for the associates that he brings in and does the experiment on, right? So the actual setting of this story is not the classic Nathaniel Hawthorne using American history or American culture or American Puritan values like he does, say, in the Scarlet Letter or some of his other stories that we'll look at. But instead, he uses this more as an unknown place, right? Possibly Germany, possibly England, right? Given the clues of the names, but it's not really set in a specific kind of setting that he's not trying to critique or look at a particular culture in this case. All right, what year was this published? 1837, right? Remembering this is in your syllabus. Right? After each story title, it tells you, not in the reading book, but in the syllabus. And it was being influenced by what literary movement? Romanticism. It's always the same answer, Romanticism. So, of course, we need to think about Hawthorne, in relation to those main romantic ideas as well that we've talked about previously, right? Nature, emotions, and of the sort of the misfit individual. Okay. All right. So that is a quick overview of Hawthorne's context and background. Let's then quickly summarize what happens in our story. Right? You'll notice that there are certain ways in which I'm sure that there's no case of copying or plagiarism, but there are certain similarities between this story and the Balzac story that we read earlier, right? We had the elixir of life, and now we have a water of life, and the kinds of symbolism, right? The kinds of ideas that those two stories explore, of course, overlaps with each other, right? So even though different writers, different countries, writing different times and places, nonetheless, they're both connected by these same interests. And this is what I said to you at the beginning of this course, is that the more of these stories you read, right, even though they tell different stories, have different characters, and are from different places, you're going to see patterns emerging, right? That there are going to be certain things, certain ideas, certain questions about, you know, human beings that are going to keep coming up for the Romantics, and of course this tends to happen in every movement, right? So if we look at what happens in our story very briefly, we have, of course, our central character of Dr. Heidegger, and he is an old man, a very learned man. Okay, we are told that he's also very singular, and here that doesn't mean that there's just one of him. It means that he's very sort of unique. There's not many people like him, right? Is what this term singular means in this case, right? Yeah, it doesn't mean there's like 5 different Heideggers and this is just one of them, right? This means that he's an unusual person. Very singular, unusual, eccentric perhaps. Okay, so we see him, he summons some old friends to his study. And these are old friends in both senses of the word. He's known them for a long time, and also they're people that he has grown old with, right? That he knows for a long time, but you know, have now entered old age. But each of them seems to have been chosen because they have, excuse me, a past. Right? So we have Mr. Medbourne, Colonel Killigrew, and Mr. Gascoigne. Right? So again, for their names, they're sort of hard to tell exactly where they're from. You know, Medbourne and Killigrew, perhaps British. Gascoigne is certainly a French name, and the widow Wycherley also seems to be a more English sort of name. So who knows? So these 3 men and this 1 woman. Right? And we see that these days, now that they're old, they all live quite sort of ordinary, unremarkable, you know, sort of lives, right? They're not doing anything wrong. They're not getting up to anything bad. Why? Because they're too old to do it anymore, right? So, of course, each of these characters is chosen for their different, like, traits, different characteristics that they have. So, you know, one is a scheming politician who is always trying to cheat people and make lots of money and be corrupt, but he can't do it anymore because he's too old and he doesn't have the energy and he doesn't have the connections and all those sorts of things. The widow, right, used to be an extremely beautiful, attractive woman, and she used to be a flirt who used to go around with all sorts of different men and was also therefore by the time standard was considered quite naughty and promiscuous. And of course, this is also one of the characteristics of one of the men that is chosen as well. Right? So all of these old characters, these 4 characters that are chosen for the experiment, they all have a past in which they were sinful, bad characters, made bad choices, were the extreme examples of this. But their old age has meant that they can't do it anymore. Right? So we then have a description of Dr. Heidegger's study, which is quite a strange place. Right? It has all sorts of artifacts lying around. It's dusty. There's a mirror that seems to capture the souls of the people who come in there. And of course, there's a magic book, right, that has all sorts of things in there, and a bronze bust of Hippocrates that we'll get to as well. So he invites them in to his study, these 4 old people who have shady pasts, who've done bad things when they were young, but they're no longer able to do them anymore. And he says, I want to do an experiment upon you, but first I'm going to show you a test that I'm running to show you what happens in this experiment. And he takes out an old rose from many years before when he was going to get married, right? And that his bride-to-be had died just before the wedding. and this was the rose that he was going to use for the wedding, and he had kept it, like he dried it in the magic book, right? So this is a common technique known as like flower pressing, right? You just put a flower between two heavy things, sometimes into a heavy book, and what it does is the moisture goes out of it, but the flower stays pressed, and so it still sort of retains some of its smell and some of its color. So you have a sort of a permanent version of that flower, right? And so he takes the pressed, dried flower, he puts it in the water, and suddenly it's a new rose again. Okay? And then he says to them, well, you know, this is the water of youth that was found by Ponce de Leon, and it's been, one of my friends shipped it to me. I have a limited supply here, but I would like you guys to test it out. Right? So he fills up some fancy glasses with that. They all drink the water, and of course, Dr. Heidegger before this has said to them, the reason he wants to do this test is that he wants to see whether they will have learned their life lessons, right? Whether they will have learned from their past. And of course, they all say, yeah, I wouldn't do the wrong things that I did in the past. I wouldn't go back to, you know, being a bad politician or being a flirt or whatever it is that they were doing. So they drink one glass. I feel kind of better. My bones don't hurt as much. You know? Oh, I'm looking a little bit better in the mirror, right? Oh, I have some more energy. And he gives them another glass. They're like, oh, I feel young. Wait, I look young. I am young, right? And of course, they drink enough to the point where they actually do have this sensation and appear to be young again, right? And immediately, we see the four reverting back to the mistakes of their youth, right? We see that they start to flirt with each other, to create schemes for ripping people off and entering back into politics and all sorts of other things. They all start to sort of court and grab at the widow who sort of like flirts with them all, right? And they start to fight over who will be her partner for dancing. And while all this is happening, of course, Dr. Heidegger is just sort of sitting there watching what's happening, watching what unfolds. And then they notice, as they're fighting, they knock over the rest of the water, and it revives a dying or dead butterfly. Butterfly lives for a little while, and then they notice, Dr. Heidegger draws to their notice that the rose that he had used first for the experiment is withered again, that it's returned to its original dried up state. And everyone stops, looks at the rose, and they realize, oh, it wore off on the rose, oh, and it's wearing off on us, right? And so within 30 minutes from drinking the original water, the effects wear off. And of course, this also happens to the four people, and so they return to their old state, and Dr. Heidegger says, all right, I've made my experiment. I've seen what happens to you when you drink this water of life, or this water of youth, rather. I don't want to do it. I would rather be old, I would rather be wise than to be young and stupid like you were. And he says, I'm not going to drink it. Nonetheless, the four of them, they set off. They're like, we want more. We need more of this water of youth. And they go off to Florida to try and find the fountain of youth. All right. So, of course, this story, just like we talked about at the beginning, is told in a way that is designed not just about the surface story, not just about this experiment done by Dr. Heidegger on his four friends, but of course is designed by Hawthorne to get us to think about certain underlying ideas, both through the symbolism and through the references that are contained within the story. Those give us the clues as to what its overall meaning is, what ideas Hawthorne is trying to get us to think about. Okay, so let's begin by looking at some of the references that are contained within the story. All right. I'll go through some of the references that you may not be so familiar with, but I will just touch on the symbols, because I imagine in our discussion that those are some things that you focus on a little bit more. So if you remember in Dr. Heidegger's study, he has a bust, which means like a statue, like just from the sort of shoulders up, right, of Hippocrates. Right? And Hippocrates, he was not a hypocrite. That's not why he's called that, but that's his name. And he was a Greek doctor, right? And sort of seen as the founder of this branch of medicine, right? So you can see there that this particular symbol was sort of associated with the school that and the ideas that Hippocrates founded, this particular symbol. And this is also his motto, right? This is the number one rule that Hippocrates said that all doctors should live by. And so influential is this that even still today, right, when doctors take their medical degree and they become doctors and so on, they still take what is known as the Hippocratic Oath, right, named after Hippocrates, right? That their number one principle is, as doctors, that they will try to do no harm. Right? So first, number one principle as a doctor is to do no harm. Don't set out, like, you know, of course there are all sorts of things all sorts of ways in which you have to trust a doctor sometimes even for your life, right? And so the principle here is that, like, a doctor shouldn't put his own interests first, shouldn't put his own medical studies or scientific curiosity or any of those other things first. Should always make sure that number one thing is they don't do any harm to the patients. All right. So let's think about this in terms of like why this would be in the story. And of course, the experiment that Dr. Heidegger does on his friends, right? At the beginning of the story, they are old, right? He gives them the water. And when the story ends, like before they go off to Florida, how has he changed them? Has he changed them in any way? They're still exactly the same as they were. So basically, even though they've gone sort of like crazy for this water and they go off to Florida, nonetheless, the idea is that he has not done harm in the sense that he didn't cause their madness. Right? He didn't do any of them he didn't change them in any sort of physical way that was permanent, right? The only changes were temporary, and then he puts them back to how they were, not even willingly, of course, it just wears off that way. So they return to their state, and there is no harm done by Dr. Heidegger. The harm that is done, of course, is done by the passion and madness of the four characters for this water, right? So in doing this, then, we see that Dr. Heidegger, he follows the principles set down by Hippocrates, right? From the very beginnings of medicine, this discipline of medicine. First, doing no harm. So that's why that's included in there. We also have a reference to Father Time, right? It's on page 45. And you can see there are many different illustrations and references of Father Time. And of course, Father Time is not a real person, believe it or not. It is what we call an allegorical figure, right? A symbolic figure, right? Of course, representing the fact that all human beings have a limited amount of time. So Father Time is usually represented, rather like Dr. Heidegger, as an old man, right? Usually a great big beard. And as part of the allegory in paintings and sketches and so on that you'll see of him, in this particular one, rather like, you know, the allegorical figure of death, What he's carrying here is a scythe, right? Of course, scythe is for cutting down wheat, but in the case of the symbolic figure of death, of course, it's to cut short the lives of human beings, right? Another popular thing that he's often holding is an hourglass, showing sort of like how much time you have left in your life, right? And then when that runs out, of course, Father Time says, oh, time's up, right? No more time. You have to move on. So Father Time allegory, of course, is a reminder to us of the shortness or the limited nature of human life, something that we've talked about in a couple of these stories already. So, of course, in Balzac's story, The Elixir of Life, right, we had the Don Juan and his attempt at a second life, right, through the elixir. And, but also thinking about the way in which time passes and the shortness of human life was also explored in our story of Rip Van Winkle as well, right? When Rip, he has 20 years that he misses out of his life, and sort of we are supposed to compare the long-standing mountains of the Catskills, like they're there for thousands and thousands of years, and Rip, of course, for him, it's just a brief lifetime. So this reference to Father Time on page 45. And of course, one of our central metaphors in here will be the water of life or the water of youth. And this myth that is attached to this guy, Ponce de Leon, Spanish explorer. As you can see, right, from his dates there, right, this is also set back around that same time as Balzac's story was set, right? So around the same time as Balzac sets his story of Don Juan. Not that Dr. Heidegger's experiment is set in that time, but there's that sort of connection to the water of life. And this is a long-standing, quite powerful and intriguing sort of myth, right? Sort of like the Eldorado myth and various other ones, that there is a secret place somewhere. Right, the Eldorado myth is in a secret city somewhere that is like full of gold and riches. In this case, there's a secret fountain somewhere that will keep you forever young. Right. So this next one is not a. Sorry, this is a. Right, here's a 16th century, 1500s painting symbolizing this. Right. So the idea, of course, you can see they're all. They've turned the. They turn the spring into an actual bath, right, where everyone is bathing, and people have come down, and it's they all become young again. And this here is not a real historical map. This is from Pirates of the Caribbean, but you can see here that they all, like even for the Hollywood movie, right, they've taken this historical myth, this historical reference. Here it says Aqua de Vida, which means water of life, right? A little ship down here, Ponce de Leon, 1523, right? And of course, Florida, tip of Florida over here, right? And a skeleton drinking with a pirate. So they're all, even in like popular Hollywood sort of stuff, this myth has been sort of recycled as well as a reference, right? So this is from Captain Jack Sparrow's map. You can buy copies of this on eBay if you like. Yeah.
How is that old island called that sun?
Yeah, Atlantis.
Yeah, Atlantis. Maybe some one could see a reference to Atlantis.
Possibly, there's like a whole series of myths that tend to be about like a place that is hidden or a place that has disappeared, or a place that's really hard to find. And so Eldorado, the water of the fountain of youth, Atlantis, right? They're all like, oh, well, if we could just find them. But I think in the days of GPS mapping and so on, I'm pretty sure that we're not going to find that sort of stuff. All right. So as I said, I'm going to leave the deeper analysis of these next symbols up to our discussion time as we come across them. But I quickly want to highlight them as we go through. One is the looking glass that is mentioned. Remember in Dr. Heidegger's study, there is a looking glass or a mirror, right, as we would call it today. This is from a famous painting by René Magritte, in which you can see the name of this painting is The Forbidden Reproduction. So he's looking into a mirror, but the mirror refuses to reproduce what is in front of him, just repeats the back. So the mirror is often used as a way of symbolizing reflection, thinking about ourselves and looking back at who we are and how we think about ourselves. We, of course, have the symbol of the rose, right? And we'll talk about how important that is, right? Why Hawthorne includes it in here. And Hawthorne really is, even though I consider him to be a very good writer, he does use a lot of very common kinds of symbols. He likes to reuse symbols that are very accessible and easy for us to grasp what their meaning is, because we've come across them so many times before. So there are lots and lots of mirrors. There are lots and lots of flowers, lots of other symbols like that that are included in many, many works of literature. And of course, at the end, we also, at some point, should talk about the butterfly and why that also would be an important symbol. Okay. So overall, right, as we come to look now at our homework questions, homework sheets rather, let's try to think through these clues that we've been given, right? We have this story about these 4 people. They're old. They get made young again for a short time, even though they don't realize it's for a short time. They revert to their old ways, their old habits, their old sins, their old problems, and then they realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm still going to be old again in 30 minutes, so this is not going to remain this way. And we see there's a stark difference between the way in which Dr. Heidegger thinks about it, right, and how he approaches this water of youth, and then his four friends, right, and how they look at it. So there's certain things that Hawthorne is wanting us to think about, both with that surface story, but also with these deeper clues that we're given, right? The references to Ponce de Leon and the water of life, and the symbolism of that. We also have, what else do we have? The Hippocrates bust, the references to Father Time, and of course these symbols that we've just seen, the butterfly and the rose and the mirror, right? So putting all these together, we want to think overall, what is Hawthorne trying to get us to think about? All right. So in order to do that, let's turn now to our prep sheets, to our homework sheets, and see what are some of the passages that you guys picked out as being important and why. And let's see if we can come up with an interpretation of this story. Let's see. Justin, why don't you begin today? What did you pick out?
I picked page 43, the third paragraph. It starts with this rose.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it important because, like, he said he took that rose for 55 years,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very long time, and it, like, symbolizes his wedding and how his, like, fiancé died before.
Yep.
And it kind of shows, like, his passion for these past 55 years, how he wanted to kind of bring back, like, his fiancé. So it drove him, like, for these years to find, like, the water. And then I think he's doing this experiment to see if it would actually work.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I think drove him to do this experiment.
Yes. So of course, this tells us that when this rose was originally picked and when he originally had it, was Dr. Heidegger an old man then? No. So of course, we do see, of course, that part of the rose symbolism is that it also symbolizes the fact that Heidegger himself was once young, right? And he once had his own passion. Has he continued to be faithful to this woman that even though she died, he didn't get, right? He still obviously seems to have some sort of attachment and some sort of love for this woman, right? So one of the things that we do see in the characters in this story that Heidegger has in common with his 4 friends is that these characters, they don't seem to change a whole lot, right, in the way in which they think about themselves in their lives, right? So, of course, we see certain changes that happen to the characters forced upon them by old age, right? So they can't do some of the things that they used to do when they were young. But we do see here that the rose does work as a sort of a marker of time for Heidegger's life. He's young, he's about to get married, right? So he has a youthful mindset, but we also see now the rose is old, it's 55 years later, and of course also Dr. Heidegger now is old, and he's 55 years older and wiser, right? So the rose here certainly works as this marker of time, and of course of his love for this woman, right? Good, thank you. Let's see, Eleanor?
I chose the paragraph that starts with, before you drink, my respectable old friends.
Mm-hmm. This is on page 44.
Why I thought this part was interesting is because he was warning all his friends about making the same mistakes as they did when they were young. But when you read after they drank, they kind of just went back to their same ways. And it made me kind of think, like, if other people were given a second chance at being young, would they change how they lived, or would they just continuously make the same mistakes?
Uh-huh.
And then it also made me ask, is it better to be young and repeat the same mistakes over again, or just heal or old?
Okay. What does this what does this tell us, though, about Hawthorne, his view upon human nature and human character?
It's not a good view.
It's pretty pessimistic, isn't it? Right? It tells us, well, he says, you know, here are these people. They're old. You know, we guess they're, you know, like 70s, 80s, right? They're really meant to be quite old people. And he tells them, like, the expectation that society has and that we have as human beings is that, you know, as you get older, you're sure you get, you know, your body starts to get older and more problematic, and, you know, you start to age and so on. But the compensation for that is supposed to be that you get wiser and you get smarter and you get more intelligent. You're able to enjoy life maybe even more than when you were young, because you know how to live, and you know how to live wisely, and you know you don't do foolish things that you used to do, right? It's supposed to be the payoff, the compensation for getting older and for having the physical aging side, is that you have the mental maturing side, right? And that's precisely what Dr. Heidegger says in that speech there. Let's read it through. It says, it would be well that with the experience of a lifetime to direct you, right? So you've been through all this experience. You basically, at the end of your life, towards the end of your life, you should have learned all these things. You should drop a few general rules for your guidance in passing a second time through the perils of youth. Think what a sin and shame it would be if, with your peculiar advantages, you should not become patterns of virtue and wisdom to all the young people of the age, right? So, I mean, this is he's sort of saying here, imagine what kind of example you would set if you behaved badly after you went back to being young. Imagine if you were to go around telling the young people who are going through their youth the first time, oh yeah, do whatever you like, you're never going to learn anything. You're just going to end up as stupid as you were and making the same mistakes you were at 20 as when you're 70, right? So this is kind of what he's warning them about, is that he's saying, you know, you should, right? You're expected after a lifetime of experience to have learned something, but as we've noted, Hawthorne's own sort of implication is that he thinks that for the most part, human beings maybe don't really change, don't really become more wise. Not that none of them do, but the majority, certainly in this story, don't seem to. Okay. let's see, Nam here?
I also take from that part. Page 44, the second paragraph.
Okay.
Actually, Dr. Heidegger already gave this piece of advice to those 4 guests before they drink that holy water. And I think, just like tell them not to be so, don't be so stupid as those young people out there, have some decency. But actually, after they drink that water, they act so ignorant and greedy, obsessed with things, just like those young people. And wow, the old one, Dr. Heidegger, was being smart and wise, decent. So I think this contrast means saying perhaps old age carries its own virtues, and those virtues can only be developed by time. That's why Dr. Heidegger rather not drink that holy water.
Yes. Although then that asks the question: why do the 4 people who do drink it, why do they fail? Because if we follow that principle of experience, as we've just been saying, then they should also have been wise, and they should have used their new lease on life wisely. But of course, we see that they don't. Now, one of the things that is important, though, is that idea of experience here, because it is one that is quite often, of course, evoked in romantic literature, right? So one of the very first, one of the very earliest works of English romanticism, right, is a book by William Blake called Songs of Innocence, and followed by Songs of Experience, right? And those 2 books are meant to complement each other, right? Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience. The poems in there actually are like they're sort of retellings of the same story, or the same characters, or the same viewpoints, or the same scenarios, but from different perspectives. One from the perspective of innocence, one from the perspective of experience, right? And of course, we as human beings, we have a very different perspective on how we see our world and ourselves and our values and so on when we're outside of an experience and when we're inside of an experience, right? When we're outside of something, it's much easier for us to be idealistic and detached and to say what should be done, as opposed to like when we're actually experiencing, when we're in the middle of it and we're like, oh, this is different to how it was before I had this experience, or right, before, when I was just thinking about it. Right? To give you an example, when I was teaching in America, I used to teach at a university where students all had to take a required world literature class. And one of the texts we had to teach was part 1 of Goethe's Faust. Right? Remember, Goethe is the famous German writer who, in Faust, Faust is the brilliant scholar who gets bored. He studied everything, and so he makes a bet with Mephistopheles, who is sort of the devil, that he can't be satisfied. Right? So, sort of a variation on the, making a bet with the devil, or selling your soul to the devil for something. And I always began that class discussion by doing a quick survey of all the students in the class. Would they make a bet with the devil? Would they make a deal with the devil? Right? And guess what? Every student always said, oh, no. If I was in that position, no, I would say no. Right? I would never be tempted by what any kind of bet or any kind of deal with the devil, right? So you can see that, from the outside, when it's not your experience, right? When you're outside the experience, it's very easy to say, oh, well, there's nothing at stake for me, so yeah, of course I wouldn't do the wrong thing, or of course I wouldn't make a deal like that, right? But then, of course, then I would change it slightly and say, well, let's say you were in a situation where it did mean something to you. Let's say your mother was dying of cancer and you loved your mother a lot, and the devil comes and says, well, I can, let's make a bet, I will cure your mother, and right? And suddenly you're like, oh, do I save my mother or do I, right? And suddenly you're put into an experience where the actual experience as to being outside of it as just a theory changes the way in which you think about it, right? Because if temptation never worked, right, nothing would ever go wrong, right? But of course, temptation works a lot of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time it does, right? And yet from the outside, we all say, no, I would never be tempted. I would never do that. But of course, it does happen all the time. So this difference between the theory, right, of the being outside of the experience, and then actually going through the experience yourself, right, and seeing how that process actually changes you and changes the way in which you think and changes your perspective, right, is a big part of what we see explored in a lot of these romantic stories, right? So think to Don Juan in the Elixir of Life, right? The first time, like when his father dies, right, he's able to sort of stand on the outside and think, oh, well, you know, I can take the elixir for myself. And then when it's actually him, it's a different experience. Right? When we see in The Telltale Heart, right, the difference between the main narrator like constantly going at midnight to look in on the old man and thinking about what he's done, and the actual experience of murdering and the aftermath are two different states. Right? And we'll see this over and over in our stories, the difference between the thinking about something, the planning, the possibility that opens of having an experience, and the actual going through of the experience are two very different things. Right? It changes your perspective when you actually do something as opposed to just think about it. Right? So the speech that he makes, the timing of it is very important, isn't it, in the story? The fact that he tells them and warns them about, this is going to be an experience that you should emerge wiser from. And he tells it to them before they've had the experience, right? Before they've had the experience. Okay. All right, let's see. 21? Page 45? Huh? In the middle? Assuredly, yep. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yes, good. So one of the things that we do see repeated in this story is this question of what's real and what is an illusion, right? So in this particular case, when they drink the water, right, it's hard for us to tell, particularly the way in which the story describes this transformation. It's hard for us to tell if the characters actually really do change, right? Whether their physical form shifts and they become all the wrinkles disappear, or if it's just all an illusion, right? If they just imagine that they have gone back to being young, right? It's hard for us to tell from the description, right? It says that, you know, there is this appearance that they have returned, right? That they've returned to being young. And remember when Dr. Heidegger does his first part of the experiment with the flower, with the rose, what is the reaction of his friends? What do they all say? Yeah? But what are the specific words of this?
Nonsense.
And it's a conjurer's trick, don't they? They say, oh, this is like a magic trick, right? And they're like, you know, you've just switched out the old rose and you've done a magic trick. Look, it's a new rose, right? Of course, you know, if you know how magic works, if it's all fake, right? It's all just sleight of hand, and you hide the old rose somehow, and you bring out the new one. It's like, wow, it's magic. It's changed from one to the other. And they say, well, you know, come on, Dr. Heidegger. You know, we've seen better magic tricks by, you know, the different magicians that we've seen come to town and do shows. Like they can do this stuff, right? Right. So they think that what he has done with the water is just a magic trick, a conjurer's trick, right? That he's just somehow hid the old one and brought out a new rose, and that he's tricking them, right? So then the experiment itself, when they drink the water, right? Remember, Dr. Heidegger, while they're doing all this, while they're, you know, making all their plans and dancing and fighting and so on, he just sits there and observes them, right? He just looks at what's going on. And as I said, it's very hard to tell whether what's happening, the way it's described, whether it's just all in their heads, that they just imagine from this water that they've been transformed into being young again, or whether it is really happening, right? Especially because we see that the mirror, the looking glass that is in Dr. Heidegger's study we're told has sort of is rumored to have sort of magical qualities, right? So even when the widow sort of goes over and she's like, oh, is my face not wrinkled anymore? Oh, am I pretty again? Right? And she's looking in there and she can't quite believe it, right? It seems, is it an illusion, right? Is it a trick mirror? Is there something that he's done to it? Or has she really been transformed? Right? So this difference between illusion and reality is something that the story, of course, plays upon, right? And, of course, it plays upon this for symbolic purposes to get us to think about these kinds of ideas as well, right? So you'll notice that, like, these kinds of stories, like Balzac's story, The Elixir of Life, right? Of course, these stories are not meant to be realistic stories. There is no water of life or fountain of youth or elixir of life that can bring you back. These things, of course, are fictional devices, right? They're deliberately also illusions that are designed to make us think about these kinds of life questions, about like how we live our lives and how much wisdom we gain and all those sorts of things along the way. Mm-hmm.
I think this was important because there's I think just the way that Dr. Heidegger had wanted water, and like also that I think the way that they had when they were young, like intimate fools and trying to get rid of eventually, and like the message I got was like what kind of showed like how it was hard for people to change.
Mm-hmm.
And how it's different because like before they said that they agreed not to act like before, but like it showed that like when they were like before they said they were not, but when they actually turned young, they like acted like before. So yeah, it sort of showed like if we're not in their shoes, like we can't say that we won't act like that. So yeah.
Yes, and this ties in very nicely to the last point too, because we see at the last part of that paragraph, right, it tells us about, again, this ambiguous illusion that seems to be happening, right? Because we see, yet by a strange deception, owing to the duskiness of the chamber, so it's kind of dark in there, and the antique dresses which they still wore. In other words, the four friends. What it means by antique dresses is that like they're wearing the clothing, the same style of clothing that they used to wear when they were young, right? Even though they're old, right? They something old people sometimes do is that they wear the fashions that were in fashion when they were young, and they still wear them when they're old people, right? They sort of get stuck in time with their clothing, and this is what happens here. So the antique dresses which they still wore. The tall mirror is said to have reflected the figures of the three old, grey, withered grandsires, ridiculously contending for the skinny ugliness of a shriveled grandame. But they were young, their burning passions proved them so, right? So, in other words, it says, what seems to be happening in the mirror is that like it looks like they're still old, right? Like their reflections in the mirror looks like some ugly old men, like all trying to fight each other for a very shriveled, ugly, skinny old woman, right? But in their heads, they all think, no, I can't be. I must be young again, right? Oh, she must be beautiful. Oh, I'm young and strong again, right? So in their heads, they have these passions and these illusions, but the mirror here seems to function, in this case, as more a reflection of the actual reality that's going on the outside. But in their heads, they've been transformed back into being young again. Okay. Right, Charlene?
So this paragraph, what is this? I think the author's description of the environment is quite interesting because he said that the room was getting darker, although the four men were getting younger, and the sun was still setting. But the author implied that the night would finally come, and getting old was inevitable and fatal.
Yes. Right. Good. Yeah. So this of course again is where Nathaniel Hawthorne is using some very common kinds of symbolism, right? Where we have, these. If we talked about the seasons and the rotation of the seasons representing different parts, different stages of life, right? So springtime often associated with birth, as opposed to wintertime, which is often associated with the death and ending of life, right? And so too, sometimes the times of day are also similarly associated with birth, death, etc., right? So morning, dawn, often associated with birth, and then of course the setting sun and the darkness and the evening, right? All associated with old age and death, right? Just as we talked about, like people don't only die in winter, they are not only born in spring, but these are used by authors as symbolic clues for us, right? And as I said, Hawthorne likes to use these classic kinds of symbols, right? He likes to use these things that, he's not an unsubtle writer, but he uses the tools of an author that are very, very sort of classic and common to be used, all right? So yes, the darkening, of course the darkening also we've seen in other stories too, where it also symbolizes a kind of like a presence of, of evil or of the darker side of humanity as well. Right? So yes, good, we can see that symbolism at work. Hey Young?
I pick page 45.
Page 45, yep.
Starting with it was now so nearly sensitive. Because this passage shows us the main character's desire to be young again. And even though they were not young again actually, after drinking fountain of youth, they believed that they became younger. And I think this kind of act makes us think about what is meant to be older and why is it good to be younger. Why these characters wanted to be younger again, even though they already lived once. And I think this is deeply related to the theme of this story.
Yes, good. Just in that passage, we mentioned the sunset and so on too, but in this particular passage, we're also told that the main light in here, and this is again a classic use of symbolism, is provided by the moon, right? We told a mild and moon-like splendor gleamed from within the vase, right? And here too, this is a famous opposition that's used a lot as well in, particularly in romantic literature, is that the sun tends to stand for reason and logic and like being able to see things, right? Just like we saw in Telltale Heart, where he uses the light and so on, right? The candles and the lamps and so on. And the daytime tends to be the time when you can see things and eyes can see things. Whereas the moon, right, tends to be used as a symbol of irrationality and of madness, craziness, illogical, right? And of course, this has a long tradition within Western culture. In fact, the term lunatic, right, a crazy person, that the root of that word, luna, means moon, right, from the Latin word. Right? Luna in Latin means moon. So a lunatic is someone who follows the moon, right? So Hawthorne also uses this symbolism here, and yes, he gets us to think about, right, this question of, well, what are the virtues and drawbacks of old age and of youth, right? Why would we want youth, or why would we cherish old age, right? And we see it from these two different perspectives, right? So that there are certain good things about being young, but also inexperience can also lead to folly, can lead to doing silly things, stupid things with your youth. On the other hand, as we said, there is, of course, the possible benefit of experience. Hopefully that we learn from our experience and we become wiser and we learn to live better. But of course, in order to do that, it takes time. And so we tend to be older when we have more experience. And so those are the two sort of trade-offs that we see, right? And in the case of these characters, of course, they don't seem to care at all about the wisdom part, and so they just chase after youth. Whereas Dr. Heidegger, he learns from their experience, right? He learns from what he sees from them, and he's like, all right, I'm good. I don't need any of that that water of youth. I'm quite happy with where I am. Okay, let's see. Is letter?
Mine was on page 44.
Mm-hmm.
The fifth paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was interesting because it shows kind of age itself. Like it describes them as being like gray, decrepit, and miserable, and it's kind of like goes along with the father time thing. Like when you're young, you always feel like you're going to be this way, and you never feel like you're going to get old. But when you're old, people always forget that they were young at one time. And I also think it's interesting because it contrasts to what happens later when they think they get young. They're like, oh, they forget that they were old. Like in an instant, they automatically forget that they were old. So it kind of goes along with that. Yes.
So there's that kind of, we're talking about like being inside and outside of an experience changes your perspective, right? So when you're outside of an experience, it's easy to sort of be judgmental of it or to think, oh, I would do it a different way, or I would do it the smart way. But when you're inside of experience, it's a whole different thing, right? You have to deal with the actual, like what's actually going on there. So you're right, even though they've been through youth the first time, right? Now they've been old for so long that it's like they have forgotten that experience. And of course, we also see that they never really learned many lessons from their youth in the first place. So the old age that they have has made them forget the lessons that they should have learned from youth, and so being put back into that situation, it's like, well, they're outside of it. Oh, I would never go back to doing this, the folly, you know, all the silly things that I did when I was young. Oh, and then immediately they revert to them, right? As soon as they're actually placed in them. Yes, good. Okay, Gustav?
Showing the paragraph on page 46, or the two paragraphs, and they all gather around it till the insect laughed like it with the generator on the snowy hair of the Heidegger. I chose this passage because first of all, I think it's the climax of the story, and then I like the contrast between the the whiteness of the new youth, the grown old men and women, and the wisdom and erasure of Dr. Heidegger. This and it was for me kind of a relief that it's like being old isn't necessarily something you suffer from, but that you can also gather wisdom while getting old.
Yes. So, well, at least the story does offer us like some relief in the sense that, like, it doesn't say that everyone is a foolish like person like the four friends are, right? Because we do, of course, end with Dr. Heidegger's sort of summary of the situation. And Dr. Heidegger does seem to be that rare person who has learned from life, who has gained something from his experiences. And therefore, when he comes to his conclusion, right, his conclusion seems to be that he doesn't need this water because he's already kind of happy, he's already satisfied. And the reason that he did the experiment was not because he sort of, oh, I wish I was young again, but was to sort of see, well, am I happy? Would I like to be young again? What would it be like to be young again? And then he does the experiment and he's like, yeah, all right, it's confirmed for me. I am happy, I do like who I am, I don't need any like artificial water or anything like that to make me happy. And so he's like, I'm just stay how I am, right?
And moreover, he doesn't even seem to be older. This doesn't seem to be the category to think in. It's about childishness or not, and he's not the one who's childish.
Yes.
So in general, it's maybe not about our age.
Yes.
What matters, but about our behavior and our ideas.
Yes. Good. So let's to close out. Then let's come back to those last three symbols then, right? Just to go over them. So first of all, we had the looking glass or the mirror. How does that function in the story? What does it do?
It shows them how they really are.
Right. It tells us the difference between their subjective sort of impressions and feelings, right? Where they are sort of, oh, I feel like I'm young again, or I think this is the way it is. But then when they look in the mirror, they can see a rather different picture, right? So this is also reflective of a movement that is sort of in parallel with a lot of Romanticism, which is a movement known as Realism, right? So Balzac, for example, in France is seen as like the founder of the Realist movement, even though he's in many ways drawing on Romantic ideas as well, right? And so realism, one of its central metaphors is that of the mirror, right? It says, like, I'm just reflecting what's going on in society. It's like I'm holding up a mirror and I'm showing you like the society and the people and the culture around me. This is you, right? If you don't like it, don't blame me, right? I'm just the mirror reflecting back what you see. So if you get angry that you see things that you don't like, it's not my fault, right? If you're ugly, if your culture is ugly, if there are things that are wrong in society, if there are evils that you're seeing in the mirror, that's just how it is, right? Not my fault. So this mirror is used in this way, right? Notice too, though, that this mirror also seems to have some sort of quasi-magical sort of properties, because we're told in the early description of the study that it seems to almost create a sort of a ghost-like so almost like a ghost-like function, right? That it's like it seems to capture the souls of the people who are in the study, it says, right? And it's almost like they leave a residue of themselves in the mirror that can then be sometimes seen again later. Okay, and then we saw the rose, which Justin touched on as well. But what is the traditional symbolism of the red rose? Love, but particularly passion, right? Is that Minho? Did you say that? Yeah. So Minho said particularly associated with passion, right? So particularly the red, because of we mentioned the four humours in an earlier class of Galen and his theory, right? The idea that you had more blood in you was very popular for a long, long time. That having more blood made you more passionate. So that colour red has become associated with passion, and so the red rose symbolises like passion, right? Passion. And of course, after 55 years, the red rose fades, right? It dies. So what Dr. Heidegger seems to be looking to see is, well, what about in here? Does passion also, can it last for a long time? Because of course, we tend to think of passion as something that, even though it might last for some time, it's usually very difficult to sustain passion, whether it's a passion for what you study or a passion for your work, or of course a passion for like your wife or husband or boyfriend or girlfriend or lover or whoever it is, right? Right. So the actual like excitement, feeling of passion is very, very, very difficult to sustain. So this symbolism, the red rose, okay? And then finally, we have that butterfly that gets accidentally sprinkled with the water when they knock over the vase. And why do you think he chooses this symbolism? Think about the life of a butterfly. What does it start as? Right, as a caterpillar, and then of course it goes into a period of transformation. It emerges. Does it look like a caterpillar anymore? No, it doesn't. It has this beauty. But do butterflies live for very long? They don't, right? They usually have a short lifespan, right? So it's connected here by these themes, A, of transformation, right? Just like the old people appear to be transformed into their youth again, the butterfly is transformed, but also this theme in the story of the shortness of life, right? There's this great beauty of the butterfly, but also it's something that is very short, very brief. Okay. So I'm hoping you're gaining a feel for these, both for the ideas and themes of these stories, and also the way in which these authors use these techniques, use these clues, right? These kinds of symbols, the kinds of references in order to get us to think about these kinds of ideas. So if we were to look overall at what this story is about, of course there are different interpretations that we could give to it, but overall it seems to be looking at the way in which we think about our lives and how we learn from our experiences, right? So as we live, right, hopefully we learn from our experiences, but Hawthorne seems to have a rather pessimistic view of this. He says, very often people don't seem to learn. Very often people seem to go through their lives and make the same mistakes over and over until they get too old to make them anymore, and then they die. Whereas there are, nonetheless, certain people like Dr. Heidegger who do learn from their experiences. And of course, if we were to think about our romantic themes, of course, we talked with the Elixir of Life, the Balzac story, about how that was playing with nature insofar as like the Fountain of Youth, the Elixir of Life, they both transcend what is normally allowed by nature, right? Normally you're not allowed to get old and then become young again. So it transcends it goes against what happens in nature. We've seen, secondly, that the question of the emotions, well, we see that the four people that are chosen are all slaves to their passions, to their emotions, in a very foolish kind of way. Whereas Dr. Heidegger, he also has emotions, he also has passions, but he has them in this much more balanced and mature way. And then lastly, with regard to the misfit individual, the thing that we see that is emphasized particularly at the beginning of the story is that Dr. Heidegger is an unusual person. He's eccentric, he's singular, as the term puts it in the first sentence, that he is someone who is not like everyone else. And this seems to be part of what sets him aside in being able to learn, whereas the majority of people in Hawthorne's stories don't seem to learn from their mistakes, right, and continue to perform them. Okay, so just to look forward to our next class, we have our last one in this section on Folly and Madness, The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. It's our second Poe story. So you'll find it's a very Gothic kind of story. And then, of course, that will conclude our look at this first section on Folly and Madness. Of course, plenty of madness, plenty of folly still to come in our other stories, but with a different emphasis. Okay, thank you guys. Please hand in your prep sheets as you go, and I'll see you on Thursday. Thank you.